You retired from Senate 3 years ago. Why do you still have a campaign account open?
Because there's money in it.
A joint investigation with our sister stations nationwide reveals the surprising, sometimes questionable ways lawmakers can spend their campaign cash even after they retire. Our TV partners in the Tampa Bay Times analyzed more than 1 million records and found roughly 100 so-called zombie campaigns. So that means a politician's campaign is dead, but their campaign war chests live on. King 5 political reporter Natalie Brand dug into an example of this type of spending by a former Washington congressman.
Democratic Congressman Brian Baird represented Southwest Washington for 12 years. He left life in D.C. in 2011 with nearly $500,000 left over in his campaign bank account, money from his donors.
Of course, the party would say, why don't you give us all the money? And I didn't think that was a wise thing. My goal was to say, as well as I could, what would the people who contributed this money to me as a candidate think is an appropriate use?
Baird used a good chunk of his cash to support other politicians you might recognize, like fellow Washington Democrats Derek Kilmer and Susan DelBene. But then he did something unusual with a whopping $200,000 of his leftover money.
Every candidate for office should be asked 3 questions.
In 2016, around 5 years after retiring, Baird formed a super PAC called 3 American Questions with a former Republican colleague from South Carolina. Their goal, to try and encourage voters to ask candidates about what Baird believes are the 3 most pressing issues of the time.
Our vision was, we had a little clever symbol, which was this, which was, I have 3 questions for you. And the idea was that people would show up at town halls, and regardless of party, they would say, I have 3 questions for you. What are you going to do, and what are you going to ask us to do about climate change? What are you going to do, and what are you going to ask us to do about the deficit? And what are you going to do, and what will you ask us to do about reforming our political process and governance? That was the vision. It didn't happen.
3 American Questions failed to get off the ground. The group's Facebook page can still be found, but their website no longer exists. That's despite tens of thousands of dollars spent on things like consultants, social media, digital advertising, even some travel.
In my case, never received a salary, never received any payment. There was occasional compensation for travel directly related to what we did. The bulk of it was to build the website, build the Facebook page, do advertising, and try to get the message out. And we hit, I think, 800,000, people saw at least some of our social media ads, and we made some traction, but we could never, I'm sorry to say, we could never really catch fire.
So looking back, do you think that this was a good use of the $200,000 in campaign donations?
I do, actually. I wish we'd been more successful. If you don't try, you'll never succeed. I can't think of 3 more important issues to have focused on.
Baird says he consulted attorneys to make sure he was following the law, but it's a law that campaign finance experts say is filled with ambiguity and gray area.
I think it's fair to say that it's not entirely clear how a former member of Congress can use campaign funds that are left over in their campaign account.
Believe it or not, there are much stricter rules now compared to decades past when former members could use campaign money for personal use. Now that's explicitly against the rules, but Congress members can give their leftover money to charities, other politicians, political parties, or PACs. The nonpartisan nonprofit group, the Campaign Legal Center, says it would like to see the FEC clarify the rules and potentially put limits on the amount of time that a campaign committee can stay open.
A campaign committee that's remaining open for several years after a member of Congress leaves office creates situations that are ripe for abuse.
If somebody's finding clever ways to take their campaign funds and sort of backdoor pay themselves, I think that should be tightened up, because that's not, in my judgment, what donors contributed to, and that's not how I think the spirit of the law is intended.
Former Congressman Baird is himself a supporter of campaign finance reform, and his use of leftover campaign money to form a PAC was unusual, but doesn't appear to violate any rules.
Now, what do his donors think?
Well, I called a number of them and spoke to a couple by phone, a couple of his top dollar contributors, who said they didn't expect reimbursements and trusted him to spend the money in a way that they would support. One donor told me, quote, he has great faith in Baird's judgment and personal ethics. politics. Now, I should note our newspaper partner, the Tampa Bay Times, called into question Baird's political donations with his leftover money while working for Vigor Shipyards here in Seattle, a role that advised on governmental affairs. Baird says he was never a registered lobbyist and says, quote, "To the very best of my knowledge, no campaign funds were used in any way primarily related to the work at Vigor." Baird left Vigor in 2012. David, in researching this story, it is glaring how complicated, confusing, and unclear at times campaign finance law really is. And we want to know what you think. Should there be tighter rules on what former politicians do with campaign funds, like requiring them to give it all to charity? Please weigh in on our King 5 Facebook page. We want to hear from you.